I thought I'd start with thinking, okay, if we want to predict something in 2100, how would it have been if we would try to predict starting in 1942, which is about as ridiculous as that. Then, for instance, well, we would see the coast of Senegal and near Saint Louis well, this is actually earlier, but pretty similar in that time. We would see the Dutch coast pre-delta works. We would see the Yangtze River when everything was still relatively natural going on there. Similar for the Mekong Delta and for the Bangladesh Ganges Brahmaputra Meghna Delta system. So just to give a bit of context when we try to predict towards 2100, that sometimes people are asking me, yeah, but is this house going to fall into the sea or the next one? And that it's sometimes borders on the ridiculous, but still we try to provide some guidance. And this is then, well, as these same coasts as you know them now, and you see that in some cases, accidentally this coast is looking pretty much like it was in 1910. This coast is absolutely completely changed by human effort, like this port of Rotterdam and all these delta works. Also, if you compare the Yangtze then and now, a whole lot more has accreted, and of course a giant economic development in Bangladesh. This Meghna Delta especially has been enormously accreting, and so complete new islands have developed, and in the Mekong Delta, obviously also there's been major changes. So we see very roughly sort of cyclic processes like this river mouth migration in the Senegal River. We see expanding deltas with very complex behavior here and there, but in many cases massive human interference. And this is also something, of course, that we have to take into account when we make predictions for 2100, or projections that these can at best be projections. Just apart from all the morphodynamic uncertainties, we cannot really predict what people will do. So with that humbling thing in mind, let's have a look at a typical example of a complex system where we might be asked to say something about the future. And this is just the last 30 years of the Ria Formosa in the south of Portugal. And you see this migrating inlet, and you see now and then it's relocated by humans most of the time. You see this barrier island expanding. And so there's a combination of this house is not there anymore. You have dune erosion, you have dune growth as well. And how do you deal with that? It's probably very vulnerable to sea level rise. Is a bit of the processes. So you have this tide dominated lagoon with very nice tidal currents and quite complex circulation patterns, wave dominated beaches, migrating inlets like here, and in short a wide range of scales, both temporal and spatial. So what are possible approaches? well, of course, we can, in some cases, we can try to extrapolate past trends, and maybe we can do a little bit more intelligent if we're more the physical geographer or geologist type. We might make an intelligent extrapolation based on a conceptual model, but people have a tendency to want quantitative answers, and even if it's sometimes difficult to provide that, I'm an engineer. We try to provide those answers, and so the approach I've been focusing on is bottom-up modeling, starting from basic processes and continuing into the future, but not just completely brain dead, but with proper validation and calibration at relevant timescales. And then I've put a box on this. This is what I'll mostly be talking about. But of course, we should also more and more look at a probabilistic approach to show uncertainties and possible bifurcations. But the sad practice is that we rarely so far manage to do both the long-term simulations and the uncertainty prediction. So this is really something that is just developing. Another approach that, for instance, my colleague Roshra Singh has been using is to do a combination of this sort of smart extrapolation, trying to sort of guesstimate what the situation will look like in 2070 or so, and then have a time slice around that period to look at how the risk develops. I think in line with the previous speaker, we can have this then, rather than just predicting probabilistically with all the extreme events into the future and doing that 100,000 times, you can do more clever things maybe by trying to estimate what the situation will be at a certain point in time and doing a time slice to analyze your risk. But as I said, I will be focusing now on this bottom-up modeling, and there's well, you can start, you have different approximations. One is to make as few approximations as you can by including at least the horizontal spatial variability in both directions using 2DH area models. But there's certainly also a place for coastal profile models and coastal planform models, and I'll make a plea in the end to use combinations of the above. So first, to give an impression of these depth average area models, I included some papers like the one by El Miladi et al., which is really tide and discharge dominated. I'll briefly show something about complex systems such as the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna Delta that we are currently working on in a big World Bank project. That is mostly also tide and discharge dominated, but now if we go to include waves, then everything becomes much more heavy and uncertain, and there's some examples of Maarten van Ormond et al., and also recent work we're doing in Saint Louis with Pieter Koen Tonnon from Datares. And this is mostly a combination of Delft 3D for the longer time scales, and then also here and there applying X-beats for the extreme events. Just for those who are completely innocent in this topic, the approach of all morphological process-based models is whether it's in 2 or 1 dimension, is you start with a bottom depth or a coastline or a coastal profile. You simulate waves and currents, and they interact with each other. They together produce sediment transport patterns, and you have then bottom changes, which you can try to extrapolate by assuming that this trend will remain, but that's a very bad approach. So you need to do is couple back the changes to the bathymetry and the processes so that you get a dynamic feedback, and that in some cases might spiral out of control, but we see that actually there's quite a few negative feedbacks as well, and systems that evolve towards an equilibrium. And so a lot of effort has gone into getting these models numerically stable, and also with some fast updating techniques, so that now it is feasible to do longer term simulations. And in cases like this one, it's in San Francisco Bay, the north of San Francisco Bay, you have San Pablo Bay, and this is an area that Mick van der Wegen and Bruce Jaffe and others and myself have done a lot of work on, because it's a very nice long-term data set, actually not even decades, but centuries of, more than a century of data of evolution of first the gold rush that brought enormous amounts of sediment to this area, and then later on a trend that turned to erosive. And you see that here is some pictures of the bottom evolution, and also of the bottom changes, and in measurements here and model over here, and you see it's over 120 or 30 year period, and you see also the cross-section changes are really represented nicely. Well, this has been the result of massive calibration and validation, but now you see indeed that different areas and intertidal areas and channel volumes, etc., how they've evolved over time, and then at some point you can say, okay, now let's see what happens with sea level rise scenarios, and obviously with the higher sea level rise you lose, for instance, these tidal flats, and you increase the channel areas. So another example where we're just starting, well, we've been working on this for a bit, but now we start to have to produce results on this with the Ganges and the Brahmaputra or Jamuna and the Meghna models, rivers that come together in this Bangladesh delta. This is an unstructured grid model using Delft3D flexible mesh of this whole system. It has simple boundary conditions, namely because it includes the whole river system, and so you have your discharges here and your sea boundary over there, and you can schematize these time series of discharges in various ways. Here is a bit of validation over an only 10-year period, where you see red dots are erosion and green dots are accretion, and black is net sedimentation in these different boxes. And you see, if you're a kind person, then you see some agreement in there. And this is in a very complex model with a largely unknown combination of sand and mud. But the good news is that decadal scale simulations in this kind of system are doable, even also for more detailed models, for instance, just of the Meghna estuary or these different estuaries. We have separate mesoscale models of those that produce similar or even more accurate results. And what we hope to do is do lots of scenarios of sea level rise and human interventions to see how this whole system might be managed properly, with a focus on the polder development there. Where, as I said, as soon as you bring in the waves, then everything turns very dynamic at relatively small scales, but that influence things on much larger scales. Here's an example from Maarten van Ormond, the famous developer of Delft Dashboard and other nice tools such as the recent Sphinx model for inundations. Here we try to look at the competing effects of tides, wind, waves, and infragravity waves with Delft 3D for moderate conditions and XBeach for storms. And, oh yeah, it's here. So what you see here is a very nice computer game called Get the Coast Inside the Red Lines. And as you see, we go through calm periods in black, and the green periods are when we have the XBeach simulations. And you see this extremely dynamic system. A hindcast was quite successful in this case, but if you mix the years a little bit, or you put 2 more heavy years in a row, you get doing predictions is really very scary. So you can get anything out from reducing inlet size to a bigger inlet size. It can move around. So a lot of things are possible. And this is now a 3-year hindcast, so maybe we can do a decade or so, but it's quite difficult to go to really long scales there. So different approaches. Let's have a look at the cross-shore approach. One thing is that as soon as you go to somewhat larger timescales, then you cannot ignore the Aeolian component. If you just keep tearing down the dune with every storm and you don't build it back up, then obviously you, after a decade or so, your simulation becomes meaningless. So we set up with Susana Costas this system with where we have tsunamis. Well, we don't look at that now, but wind and storm waves and moderate waves. And we have storm erosion and moderate conditions. One, the XBeach in stationary or stationary, and an Aeolian transport model, the 1D Duna model. For those of you who are less familiar with XBeach, it can be run in 3 modes. Stationary, that's fast and simple. Surf beat is a little bit more complex with the wave groups and the infragravity waves resolved, or you could have a non-hydrostatic mode. Now we use, in this case, these 2 stationary and surf beat modes. Let's just quickly continue. One of the problems with applying such a model to longer timescales, it was originally developed for storm events, and it is very good at breaking down a dune. The problem is that it tended to always do that. So if you look at the real development of profiles in Praia de Faro, then really you see maybe 2 modes, but you see especially not a lot of change. And if you look at what XBeach would do is sort of make these huge scarps, and Susanna was complaining that she was losing her barrier island. I said, well, you have to calibrate a little. No, but she kept losing it. So we had I had to acknowledge that there was something really wrong. And this swash zone, you have, let's say, two options, either to resolve what's happening on the short time scales and really look into the swash processes. And I'm sure this is something we need to do, but we couldn't wait for that because it's a very long and difficult road. And the other approach is to have some sort of heuristic approach with an estimated equilibrium slope for the swash zone, typically steeper for coarser grain size. And we introduce an upslope term in the swash zone that nudges the profile towards a desired berm slope. And with that, instead of having this, with an increasing berm slope, you can completely stabilize not just this area, but the whole profile. Because the point is, if you keep eroding away a lot of sand from the dune, you introduce a source of sediment in the rest of the profile that completely ruins it. So with this simple approach, you can stabilize that. And now it looks very much like the behavior of the other ones. And it can still, you don't fix the profile, it can still accrete or erode, as you see here. So this simple approach is helpful in resolving the treatment of steep beach faces, and it can be tuned to existing situations. And now you're ready to couple it with a dune growth model. So, and as you see here, Katrina Combiado et al. We've done more detailed validation of this for an actual storm, plus the subsequent recovery. So you see a big chunk taken out of this profile and an almost complete recovery after a while. And this is in a combination of this berm slope effect plus a bit of a run-up correction for the incident waves that X-Beach missed. Now, to look at the beach and dune, the dune model, as I said, is this 1D model. It's inspired by Croy and Herman and Duran et al. And Duran and Moore, you know. Similar processes that are also in Aeolis now. And first of all, we looked at this kind of relatively short-term behavior. And the nice thing, you can try to look at the age of the sediment, etc. And after 2 years, we had sort of almost the same profile that we had before, but a lot had changed in the meantime. If you want to go to longer simulations, and also in cases where you don't have a closed coast, but there can be longshore gradients, you also have to include, even in a cross-shore profile model, you have to include some effect of the longshore gradient. And how you can do that is by assuming that the longshore transport gradient is some factor times the longshore transport itself. So that gives you a distribution over the coastal profile of this longshore transport gradient. So if the most of the longshore transport takes place in the upper part of the profile, then your accretion or erosion due to longshore transport will also take place in that area. And with that, you allow profiles to erode, as you see here, or to accrete. And you see here this combination of doing that in combination with with the aeolian transport, and you can distinguish which process has brought sand to a certain place. And you see, especially in these stable or slightly eroding cases, you get the highest dune. And if you have a very strongly accretive case, then you get less high dunes. This is something that aeolian people know, but for us, for me, this was a nice eye-opener. And so with this kind of approach, you can now even simulate, let's say, barrier, sort of these beach ridges or dune ridges that occur on a longer time scale. This is just repeating the same signal all over again, but of course you could do this with more realistic sequences of actual years. And this is work in progress, but it shows that a profile approach is in principle feasible even on longer time scales, and then of course you could play with sea level rise and such processes. So dynamic profile simulations can be carried out over longer periods, including storm events and recovery, but the swash zone boundary condition is essential, and longshore gradient can and must be included on a longer time scale. And also the aeolian transport, it's important then. But another way to look at these kind of systems is to focus on the planform evolution, because this cross-shore profile approach is nice if you have approximately a longshore uniform situation, even though you may have a longshore gradient. But now what happens if you have a much more complex system and planform evolution? Then the question is, can we make a better, more flexible coastline model? And the existing models, I'll quickly go through this, but many of you may have seen it before, but existing coastline models have nice record in engineering, but they are very limited in what they can reproduce. So no fun processes like spits, islands, migrating inlets, or barrier rollover. An inspiration for this latest model is the model by Ashton et al., the coastal evolution model, which is a grid-based system, but it is based on very simple transport formulas relating the relative angle between the waves and the coastline to the sediment transport, and with a special feature upwind approach for high angle waves that have an incidence of more than 45 degrees, which leads to this special instability called high angle instability, as you see here in these schematic simulations and here in reality. Very nice. So, well, the one model is meant for engineering, but it's very limited, and the other model is more schematic, but it's beautiful and rich. So what we try to do is something in between, using the approach similar to all coastline models, that you assume that when the coast advances or retreats, the cross-shore profile stays more or less the same. Then you can have your sediment transport in between coastline points. You look at the angle between the waves and the coast normal to see what the sediment transport is, and you can then simulate the cross-shore movement of the profile. Here's an example for a still relatively conventional coastline model. Now the new thing is, and it is somewhat it's been done before for simple coastlines to do the same approach on a vector base. Then the coastline is a string of points, and the coastline, there's no reference coastline, but the reference coastline is the line between the two adjacent coastal points. But I took this a bit further and allow it to go in all directions and flexible due to regular regridding, and also to allow various coast sections that can merge and that can do all sorts of interesting things. So you have your coastline, which can be any number of polylines, or it can be closed islands, and you can have a number of structures that can block the waves or can block the transport. And the different coastline sections see each other. They shield each other from waves, for instance, similar to structures that can shield a section of the coast from wave attack. And then with this approach and this regridding, you can have this kind of nice spit evolution, and also the effect of the shadow on the coast behind it. And with some extra sort of algorithms, you can take care of the renumbering and regridding of what that happens when an island merges to the coast or a spit merges onto its own coastline. And then you get this kind of behavior, and that can break up again, etc. So you can, instead of doing rather marginal changes, you can really go through whole evolution cycles of a coast. And a nice example is the innovative mega nourishment descent motor, which you see here. That's with the original big sandy hump of 20 million cubic meters that very quickly developed into a spit that then grew along shore. And this is a very nice test case that many people have studied. And this turns out to be very nicely reproducible with this shorelines model. And you can do some quantitative comparisons, and and I may be able to show you at the end. Nowadays we can even do data assimilation on this and reproduce this behavior. Something really interesting that happens a lot, and also happened in a project that we're doing in Senegal, in the Senegal River near Saint Louis, is the inlet mouth behavior. And of course there you have two options. You can have a two-way coupling between a depth averaged or a morphological model, where your coastline model modifies the 2D bathymetry and vice versa. But we can also implement a heuristic model that maintains the width of the channel. And that could be a function of discharge or tidal prism, and it pushes back when the coastline moves the channel center line. And it distributes the retreat of the narrower part towards neighboring points. In this case, if it's a river, you put it in the seaward direction. And so this is what we tried here in this project. And you see here, you indicate the location roughly of the river mouth, and then the model just tells you what the exact channel axis is, the center axis. And then if your initial coastline is green and it's too narrow, it turns it into the black. It pushes the sand to the next two seaward points. Very simple mechanism, but that was able to do this kind of thing, where you see here we have the simulated and here the observed from Landsat imagery, and you see that very similar behavior, if not always quantitatively exact, is reproduced here. So here, for instance, we see the tip of the spit versus time, and here the spit width, which in this case turned from almost 0 to 3 kilometers, and then the breach width increased and then decreased again. And after artificial breaching, in 2003, there was a catastrophic event where this whole system seemed to be evaporating, so this is like this. After a short while, this 5-meter wide trench turned into this river mouth, and then the river mouth sort of completely disintegrated, and these coastal areas were severely affected. So you had a 5-kilometer wide area that was suddenly completely exposed to the sea. And you see that this simple model is able to replicate this and produce also the time series of this width and the location of the northern and the southern spit ends. The good news is that after a while the situation sort of re-establishes. So this is the prediction of what will happen over a ridiculously long period. And then we've been looking at scenarios of management. For instance, in 2080, then this river becomes so long that again Saint Louis will be flooded by the high discharge events. So then we breach it and we try to see what happens again. And then you see after a while it returns to this period again. So this is something that you can in principle do in a cyclic manner. Okay. So this is a possible solution for this area, we think. So conclusions for this shorelines approach is that it's a fun new model and a prototype for next generation coastline model for engineering purposes. It's available in open source MATLAB code. It's very nice for explaining coastal processes, and what we're doing or need to do is we need to couple it with the profile model, and we're coupling it with a large-scale wave model to get the correct large-scale refraction, and couple it with large-scale tidal morphology model. So going to longer time scales, it requires a lot of things in terms of smart morphological updating techniques, input reduction, parallel computing, robust numerical methods, but it's much more important to have a continuing realistic behavior. For instance, maintaining sandbars or at least the mean profile, realistic slopes, erosion and recovery of beaches and dunes, and better modeling of large shoreline changes. And so long-term modeling strategies may be a combination of for instance, a 2D flow model with shorelines and these profile models to look also at the coupled dune behavior. And then the strategy could be that you have either a 2D morphology model for the larger features coupled with shorelines for longshore transport and maybe for bank erosion. Or you can have a cross-shore model including an aeolian component, but with the longshore gradient effect, which may be retrieved from the longshore, from the coastline model. Or a coastal planform model with heuristic models describing inlet response, cross-shore behavior, etc. And well, all this we should use increasingly data assimilation, since we're getting so many coastlines from satellite imagery that we can really make use of those. And ensemble prediction and other probabilistic approaches. And I think I should leave it there. Unless you want to know about recent things we're doing with data assimilation. But this is very recent work by our master's student Mostafa Saleh, who has now implemented ensemble Kalman filtering in Shoreline S. And here you see what happens if you don't include that, and the blue line is on top of the data more or less if you do include that. And how this then also leads to an improved parameter estimation. But okay, let's stay here.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dano. Yeah, so we're sort of getting to the hour, but I'm sure there's plenty of questions. So maybe a few minutes of questions for Dano. So feel free to ask directly, or if you want to type it and I can read.